Hi everyone, welcome back. We are speaking today about the history of the medieval Middle East, and specifically about a moment called the translation movement that occurred in the Abbasid Empire during, let's say, between 750 to 1000. That is the moment in which a lot of Greek science, Indian science, all sorts of different material that was in a variety of different languages was translated into Arabic. Now we're going to look at that. Now, just a bit of background. Remember that what we today call Islam and the sort of Islamic empire first emerged out of an area in the Hijaz here, so Mecca and Medina, and then went out first to Syria and then to Iraq and then conquered Persia and then North Africa. And so by 750, right on the eve before the Abbasid Caliphate comes along, the Abbasid dynasty comes along, there was actually a sort of united world of Islam. Of course, wasn't much communication between them, but it was all of a sudden this giant area from what's essentially Pakistan and Central Asia all the way to Spain was connected under one rulership and one political class. Now that fell apart a bit as Spain became an independent space, but the Abbasid Caliphate that took over during this high point between 750 to 950 with its capital in Baghdad controlled a large amount of space. And this was kind of, even though it was the high point and it had kind of the most important and effective rulers in Baghdad, one of the interesting things is that the intellectual golden age of Islamic thought, of Arabic thought, not so much that it represents the pinnacle in which everything came down, but the moment in which a discourse came together to create something that we now know as maybe Islamic civilization or Arabic civilization, let's say package of knowledge, of texts, of basic assumptions, of a language of interaction, Arabic, that came together, that basically spread across the world and became the center of knowledge production and the basis for science and for a lot of what was considered culture and knowledge at that time. That came about during the Abbasid period. Okay, it came about starting around 800 to 1000, and the high point was really 1000 to 1100. Ironically, the most productive intellectual parts, kind of 900 to 1100, came at a moment when the Abbasid Empire was falling apart. But it built upon a lot of the developments that were occurring during the high point of the Abbasid period. So if you remember, we're looking at this period, Abbasid Revolution, 750, but really starting in around 813 to 950, 100 years, 150 years of intense translation and expansion of scientific, scientific texts into Arabic, from Greek, from Syriac, from Persian, from a few from Sanskrit. They're shifting this all into Arabic at that time, and that is the translation movement. And eventually this lays the basis for a new type of synthesis, a new type of Arabic Islamic learning that comes to dominate much of the known world at that time, at least up to the borders of China, and then up to parts of medieval Europe. So what is the translation movement? As I pointed out, it is this moment between 750 and 950 in which they're translating texts into Arabic. It's one part of a general cultural fluorescence under the Abbasids. And really the high point reaches actually after the peak of the Abbasids, but it's really a moment in which there is a definition of a canon, basically core texts that become central to learning and to knowing at that time. And at this point, it also really develops an Islamic culture, right? This is no longer a culture of a small Arab-speaking minority that is ruling over the subject peoples. It becomes part of a culture in which all Muslims, and we'll see many non-Muslims, were actively part of equally. There's other parts that we've talked about so far. One is the development of the religious sciences, that is going through hadith and through law and then theology, which we're not going to get into, but you got a bit of it. And then the other part we're going to look at is literature, poetry, and prose. But right now we're just going to look at basically the translation movement and the development of so-called Islamic science. Now, when I say Islamic science, what am I actually talking about? Is Islamic science just science that Muslims do? Is it science that's somehow motivated by their religious beliefs? Like some people would say that Islamic science is, science that uses as its proof the Quran and the Hadith. And in fact, there is actually something called prophetic medicine and prophetic things like that, which developed later on, which tries to do that, basically give a Hadith or a traditional gloss over many aspects of just medicine at that time. But no, what we're really talking about is science that developed in the Islamic world at that time. And we call it Islamic science because Islam here is bigger than just the religion. It's more of a civilization, right? And that's why, for example, because we're really talking about something that can expand and include people who are not just speaking Arabic, who are speaking a variety of languages, whether that's in Italy or whether that they're in Bengal or in Burma. All of these people are actually partaking indirectly or directly in Islamic science. And this also includes a lot of people who aren't Muslims. So maybe we'll define Islamic science as this. This is what I came up with. It's a canon of texts. So there's a set body of texts that are seen, practices and ideas that are seen as kind of definitive and authoritative. Usually they're written in Arabic, and they usually came out starting around the 800s, 850s, and continuing to about 1200. And that moment is the kind of formative moment for this canon of Islamic science that then gets used in other places like India, or eventually gets ported out to medieval Europe. So in South Asia, for example, the medical canon of Islamic science is known as Unani or Greek medicine, basically because it's a continuation of much of the classical Greek ancient tradition. And that same canon also got ported or imported out into medieval Europe, partially because they see this and they understand it correctly as a continuation of the classical heritage that is the Greeks and Romans. Okay. So just one last piece of terminology here. Ilm. Okay, the word ilm means science. It's a word we're going to encounter pretty often. The plural of ilm is ulum. Now, science, it doesn't mean just the natural sciences. It really means any type of science, any systematic approach to knowledge. And in fact, ilm itself by itself can just be knowledge. But we're really talking about a word that's kind of vaguely aligned with our notions of science. But what that means is that science can be many other things than what, just like biology or physics. So there is ilm al-hadith, the science of hadith, because there was a systematic way of collecting hadith, that is reports about the Prophet Muhammad, about what he did and what he said. So they had a science for that in ilm al-hadith. Okay, they also had, for example, ilm al-najum, the science of the stars. Now you might think that's astronomy. No, there's a different word, ilm al-hayat, which is for it. Astrology is about understanding the impact of the heavens onto human lives and human society, right? So astrological interactions, and to understand that, you have to know where the planets are and where the stars are, and that is the science of astronomy, which was basically figuring out when stars and planets would appear in the sky, so then you could figure out their actual effect on humans. Two other pieces of information here. The word alim. Alim is someone who practices ilm. In other words, a scholar. The plural of alim is ulama. Ulama is basically the scholars in general, but also the scholarly class. So keep this all in mind as we talk about it in the next few lessons.